continues to push everything up and up and up. But notably, people can't buy more things. People don't actually have more wealth. The dollar amount just keeps going up, and we're kind of in this endless spiral.
It just makes more people poor.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I am here with my first live interview with Hannah Cox. We are at Manuel's Tavern in Ponce Highlands, Atlanta. So we are here. We're going to talk a little bit about the $15 minimum wage, what the hazards of that are, and then what of modern monetary theory. So this location that we're at, please go support. There's going to be a link in the description to their GoFundMe page, because this site has been hit pretty hard from the pandemic. So make sure you go support them, show them what volunteerism is all about. So welcome.
So good to be with you. I'm excited to meet you in person. We've
really
been Twitter
good.
friends for a few years, I think.
Yeah, I think
at least
you're right.
a year, but probably longer than that.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. And so I wanted to have you on and have you come in because, I mean, I have a degree in business, and so I know like the issues between the $15 minimum wage hike, but modern monetary theory is something that's, it's almost new age that I didn't even learn in school. So I'm still
it's totally
behind.
made up.
Yeah. So it's another one of these subjects that I wanted to get an expert as yourself, and who better than somebody that's working for, what is it? What's FEE stand for?
The Foundation for Economic Education.
Yes. So it's kind of your forte, right?
Yeah, it's funny because people always assume that I'm an economist or that I went to school for economics. They'll say, what did you do to get into your line of work? And I'm like, actually, my degree is in music business. So, but that's the great thing about economics. Growing up, I was never particularly good at math. I really was not someone who would ever have thought I'd be working in the econ field. But what happened for me was I was given a book called The Law by Frederick Bastiat. I read it a number of years ago, and it was in reading that I started to realize economics was really a lot more about studying human action, what we would call praxeology. And there's actually, when you get to the mathematic components, all of that's really sort of made up, and it kind of is of a totally different school than what I adhere to, which is the Austrian School of Economics.
Yeah. And
so I think that's encouraging for people. You don't have to like math, you don't have to like graphs. You can actually study economics and really get to understand its mechanics in a way that is ascertainable and actually even interesting, because we're looking at what choices do people make? How do we interact in a free society? And when you start moving into things like modern monetary theory or Keynesian economics, what they're really trying to do is figure out how do you micromanage an economy, right? How do you make all these decisions and pull all these strings that are going to perfectly orchestrate the lives of 330 million people? It's a joke. You can't do that. You need to actually remove those barriers from people's lives, let them make free choices, and not impede those things. People will make the best choices for themselves if given the opportunity to.
Absolutely, and I think that's the big thing. And we've been seeing, like the libertarian parties out there. I think it was even New Hampshire, which we won't get into the whole issues in New Hampshire right now, but they actually pointed out the other day about child labor laws and everything like that, and how they are actually a hindrance to the economy instead of promoting safe working conditions and everything like that. The reason why they were meant to regulate the marketplace in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And they're a barrier for individuals. I love talking about child labor because I was a child who liked to work under the table growing up.
Yeah.
And I loved to work. It was my favorite thing in the world, and I had all kinds of jobs, and it taught me so much. It also taught me financial skills, but it gave me a really strong work ethic. And had I really not been allowed to do that and prevented from doing that, I would have been starting off much further behind by the time I entered the work field or by the time I entered college.
Yeah.
So I understand why those laws were put into place, but in actuality, they really have ended up hurting the individual more than protecting them.
Yeah, and there was a tweet that went viral the other day of a 14-year-old working at Burger King, and this tweet actually said, "This is so sad." And I'm like, why is this sad? He's learning a skill. He's learning to work. And I'm the same as you. I mean, I like to work and do stuff like that. I like being productive. I think it teaches us something that is kind of lost on most of society nowadays. Most people just want to sit home and do nothing. So.
That's right. And I mean, if you look back at all of history, the idea that working at 14 is somehow sad or hurting the person is hysterical. Kids used to have to work long hours in the fields alongside their families just to put food on the table. There's nothing wrong with working.
Oh, and that's the other thing, is that child labor laws do not protect children from working for their families.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference between a family or a close personal friend?
Right, exactly. Nothing.
But, okay, so let's dive into what we're actually talking about, though. The fight for 15 right now, it's being pushed. I was completely shocked. I need to get off Clubhouse at like 10 o'clock at night because somebody in a debates channel had said something like 75% of people support the $15 minimum wage. But what really does the minimum wage hike, what would it hurt? Like, what does it do to the economy?
Yeah, first and foremost, I never trust a poll. As somebody who's administered polls, you can get polls to say a lot of things if you know how to ask the right questions and who to ask and that kind of thing. So, yeah, right. But I do think that more people than I'm comfortable with are misled on the benefits of the minimum wage, right? And it just really shows us that we're not giving our students a solid economic foundation. Because when we talk about the problems with the minimum wage, we're getting into the very basics of economics, And we're getting into this idea, once again, that you can somehow interject between employee and their employer and have a better negotiator in the government than you can as an individual. Ultimately, what we see with a minimum wage is that the real minimum wage is zero. Ultimately, if you continue to move the dollar amount that someone has to be paid to do a job above what the actual value of that labor is, we ultimately always see companies scale back the number of workers that they're hiring. They especially start to scale back in those entry-level fields, and that's where, again, it's so essential that people get those early entry-level jobs, and hopefully they get them young and are able to move far past what a minimum wage job would be by the time they're in college or graduated from college. But when we're preventing people from getting access to that, then they don't get to develop those skills, they don't get to actually increase the value of their labor to where then they are worth more, have a higher demand on the market. So there's a real social capital that's involved with the minimum wage, and we can look at what would happen if we gave people this amount of money. Not only would that then push a lot of people out of work, eliminate a lot of jobs, but we also would see that employers always pass those costs on through their products. And so you see that the products they're producing, those things would increase too. And so then the dollar continuously becomes worth less. And that's something I like to point to a lot. People talk a lot about why they don't make more. They need to be asking why their dollar can't buy more. And if you watch what's been happening under things like modern monetary theory for the past couple of decades, we've increasingly been devaluing the dollar. And that's the real reason that people can't keep up with the rents.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. And the thing, and that's the big issue with the $15 minimum wage, is the cost of labor getting passed on, causing inflation. And now most people didn't think inflation was really a big deal, but then I paid $4.75 for gas the other day. So
yeah, it's
now I buy premium, but
still
it's still $4.75 for gas when I was paying $3.25 like 3 weeks ago. I mean, it's like, that's not just that. I paid probably $20 more for 2 steaks than I did the other day. So we are seeing inflation happening real time, and it's starting to spiral out of control. A $15 minimum wage would just completely end that. And when you see companies that are like Amazon and Walmart and all that, they are pushing for this $15 minimum wage because they know they're the only ones that can pay it. A company like this that we're in right now, they would be out of business if they had to provide a $15 minimum wage. They can't sustain it. It's not good for small businesses, and it's a barrier to entry for small businesses.
And for the individual, yet again, I've watched this with, I have 3 younger siblings, there's 4 of us, I was the oldest, and I always had lots of access to jobs when I was coming up. When I was 16, I was working in a grocery store. Then I watched my 2 younger siblings, by the time they got to high school under the Obama era, they couldn't get those entry-level jobs.
Absolutely.
Why? Because they kept jacking these prices up, because now you had people who were a bit more educated, had more work experience, competing for those same entry-level jobs. And so in high school, they didn't get that entry-level job experience. They instead had to do things like babysit or go work outside in lawn care. They couldn't get their foot in the door in that way, and it hurt them in some way. So it's not just the small business owner or employer that it hurts the individual as well.
I think the stats, and it's from the CBO, which is the one that kind of tells Congress how much these bills are going to cost. And the CBO estimated that it would pull 1.4 million out of poverty, but it would get rid of as much as 2.4 million jobs. I think that alone shows that it's not it's not reasonable to even think about that. Because you're right, because companies that can afford it will automate. At some point, there's a threshold where automating is better than the civil side of paying workers to do something for more than they're worth.
That's right. And the really interesting thing to me about this is that, you have the left who constantly harps on the problems with big corporations, these big greedy corporations, and especially, they attack Amazon and Walmart for some of their employment practices. But if you consistently push small businesses out of the picture and you limit the competition in the market, these big companies know that then not only do they not have the competition in the actual marketplace, but they don't have the competition for employees, which is also a very hard thing to come by, good employees. Yeah. What happens then? The employees have less options for places they can go work. They have less negotiating power if they don't like how they're being treated at one company. Yeah. This is something that is harmful for everybody, except for the big conglomerate companies that are going to push everybody out and have total control of the workforce. It's just a very short-sighted idea to push for this.
Well, and what people also don't look at is where it's been tried. Look at Seattle, for example. The people are actually making less per year than what they ever made in the first place at their old wage, because they're actually working a whole lot less overtime because companies aren't willing to provide more overtime. They'll create 3 shifts instead of having 2 shifts that work overtime because they actually can pay less in that regard. Mm-hmm. The other thing that $15 minimum wage has always done is it is another way to print money for government. The only people that actually gain anything is government, because it puts more people into higher tax brackets, and it brings wealth down, which ultimately creates more tax revenue for them, even though all they're doing is creating more inflation.
That's exactly right. And we consistently see that, anytime you see government pushing for these kinds of policies, I promise you they're going to get their cut of it. Because not only do then companies have to pay this higher minimum wage, but then it pushes up the cost of labor for people who are more educated, who do have a higher value. Because then, if I'm getting paid $18 as a college graduate per hour, all of a sudden I see this 16-year-old kid getting paid the same thing, I'm going to go and demand more money, and I'm probably going to get it. And so it continues to push everything up and up and up. But notably, people can't buy more things. People don't actually have more wealth. Yeah. The dollar amount just keeps going up, and we're kind of in this endless spiral.
It just makes more people poor.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And then the question I've seen quite a bit too is, and it kind of goes with taxes and stuff like that, is if we can just print money, why do we even have taxes? I think that kind of leads into modern monetary theory as well, correct?
Yeah, it's a really interesting theory. As I said, I didn't go to school for economics either, so I'm glad I didn't, because I probably would have had that shoved down my throat. That's mostly what they teach. But MMT is a newer theory. It's really been around for a couple of decades. It's funny, I was reading this book recently about the election between Barry Goldwater and JFK, and they were talking about, the writer was talking about how JFK had this huge breakthrough that you didn't have to balance the budget, and it was a left-wing author, so he was kind of praising it, and I was like, this was the downfall of our society. You think this is a good thing that he thought we didn't have to budget the budget? Yeah, I was just off on a tirade. But that's kind of the origins of it, was this idea all of a sudden that we didn't need to balance the checkbook, that we could just keep spending money, just keep printing money, and it would all sort of work out. We've seen that has failed time and time again throughout the past couple of decades while we've been sort of trying this. And what we see happen is that they'll sort of have an administration that goes full throttle into that, and then they'll start to pull back as the economy starts to collapse and things start to really go downhill. So, I think what you see with the idea behind modern monetary theory is that inflation doesn't matter, and that you don't have to balance your bills, and that you don't have to really have this kind of accountability. And they know that it's not true, because if ultimately they truly believe that, why would we have taxes?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Well, and from what I've read about modern monetary theory is that taxation is needed in order to curb that inflation, right? So, because when you print more money to put that money into the marketplace, they need to tax it to pull that money back out of the marketplace so that it's not so worthless, right?
That's working so well for them.
We still show that we're $27 trillion in debt right now.
Exactly.
So it really doesn't make much sense yet, and they're still trying to tax more and more and more. And it's not really even taking hold, because you can see all the politicians in Washington being like, no, we need to tax you more. We need to raise taxes in order to be able to pay for this. But if modern monetary theory was correct, then we wouldn't need to do that,
Right, that's exactly right. And I have to also sort of go off on a tyrant here, but I think it is such an elitist argument. I often also hear them say that inflation's not a big deal. It's not, a very big deal. You're silly for worrying about this. And I am not that far removed from having to live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
I remember that. I remember graduating college. I remember working my first couple of jobs. I remember struggling. I remember wondering if I could fill up my tank with gas fully because I wasn't going to have enough, to totally fill it up, and that kind of thing. To suggest that it's not a big deal for gas to go up by $1 a gallon in a couple of weeks, to suggest that it's not a big deal for the price of groceries to be escalating something like $60, over the past couple of months, like that's a huge deal to millions of families, to millions of people across this country, and even to people who it's not taking literal food out of their mouth. It is still making them poorer. It is still reducing the number of things they can buy, the experiences they have, what they can save for their future. It is a huge deal, and I'll never get over that kind of very elitist attitude of this just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to you.
At this point, what difference does it make?
Right, that's always, how often do we have to hear that phrase from them? What difference does it make?
What difference does it
after
make?
Hillary, after Fauci's lies, now with inflation, what difference does it make?
They
just keep wrecking people's lives.
They're going to keep pushing until we are Venezuela. And
exactly.
That's really what it is.
And that's where their policies are headed. I did a whole episode on my show based about this, looking at their claims of democratic socialism being so different. They're always pointing at, Switzerland and Sweden. Look over here, don't look over here at Venezuela. But when you dig into it, the policies that they're pushing don't look like the policies that the Norwegian countries actually have in the books. They look like the policies on the book in Venezuela.
Well, and that's a good point, because most of those Norwegian companies actually have more capitalism than we have here. I mean, they are more free market ideas than what we have, and our government likes to propagate them because they call themselves socialist, because they can provide some basic necessities that they want to provide, but it's not doing the same amount of taxation and everything like that they're trying to propagate here.
That's right. If you look at these countries, they do have big social programs, and they do have very high taxes. Even the average person, we're talking low to middle income, is paying 50+% of their income. What do they get for that? Well, they get free education, although my research shows they still come out with a good amount of debt, actually. They get free child care. They get free health care. If you ask me, if I get these three things, is it worth 50+% of my income? Absolutely not. Not at all. And aside from that, when you really look at their economics, when you look at their policies on the books, they are more of a free market society than we are, and they really don't have many of the things that you hear people like AOC or Bernie Sanders pushing for. You certainly don't see them employing many of these practices of the MMT kind of scheme going on, and that's because they did try it. It's true that they had sort of a blip in the 70s, 80s, 90s where they did start moving more towards socialism and more towards a government-controlled economy, and it went really poorly from them. They went from being very wealthy countries to really going bankrupt, and so in the 90s they started clawing their way back and moving back towards free market capitalism, which has been very good for them.
Yes.
They do very well as far as their GDP and as far as the quality of life that they have there.
Yeah, and throughout even our history, we know that more government spending does not create more wealth. Just look back at FDR's New Deal. But the New Deal actually created, it's estimated by most economists that it extended the Great Depression by about 7 years.
Right.
Every time we've cut taxes on individuals in this country, we've had record revenues. Even under the Trump administration, though they were minimal, we had record revenues. And then now we want to, again, add more taxes on business, which people don't understand that when I say businesses don't pay taxes, it's not because they're using loopholes. It's because they're making you pay those taxes, which, again, is just raising the cost of the good. The businesses don't care. They're going to make their money. They're just going to pass it to you, the customer, and put it in the price. And they know that they can cut enough wages and they can automate enough with the big companies that they don't have to, that they can push, mom and pop shops out of the market.
Mm-hmm. It's frustrating, and I think especially for people like us who pay a lot of attention to history and what's been done, it's frustrating when you can point to this having been tried before, and we know how this is going to go. We've seen it done over and over and over again.
Yes.
And I think if there was one thing we as libertarians could impart to people is that companies don't pay taxes and countries don't pay tariffs. You do. The people
exactly.
do.
and I just saw an article the other day where Trump lied when he said that those countries
Yeah,
pay
that was
taxes.
Brad's article, actually.
It was Brad's.
Yeah.
So Brad's article.
Thanks, Brad. I think if people could really wrap their minds around that, they'd start to kind of understand that these talking points are just that. They're just talking points. They never work out for you, the consumer. And we do know what does produce wealth. And, I had numerous issues with Trump. I was not a Trump supporter and was really aghast at some things that happened under that administration. But when it came to the economics of it, he had a lot of good policies, and we did see an immediate turnaround. You know, we'd been in a very sluggish economy under Obama for years. I had graduated college into one of the worst economies since the Great Depression. I remember those days. It was hard for people to get work. It was hard to get jobs. They said that my generation would lose, you know, over $1 million over the course of our working life because we started off so much more behind in our early careers. And once Trump came in, things started to turn around really quickly. We did see the price of goods start to fall. We saw that there were more jobs, so many jobs. You know, it was like a job everywhere you looked. There really were a lot of gains being made. And I don't think anybody can argue with that. So it's very frustrating to have experienced that and to watch it and to see people just want to rewrite history and pretend it didn't happen.
Well, and they want to pretend it didn't happen because they forced it all to go away when they forced COVID.
Right.
You know, when they forced the COVID lockdowns and they forced all that to happen, that was, and you could look at it just as political as anything else, a way to bring down all the economic success that we had and say, what are you talking about? We're worse off than we were because we're locked down. And I'm the same way, and there were things that, yes, the Trump administration did well. I had said that the tax cuts didn't go deep enough because he just wanted to basically put his name on tax cuts and say, I got tax cuts through. Because then he did that and then started adding tariffs and stuff like that. So tariffs and his foreign policy was on point too. So this isn't a foreign policy discussion, but as we are starting to see now when it comes to, you know, what's happening with Israel and North Korea and everything like that, those policies, those foreign policy issues really worked under the Trump administration. So if there's two things that I give him credit for, was the economy and his foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. You know, it was such a breath of fresh air to hear a Republican president speak out against endless war. You know, it was wonderful. And I think so many libertarians have been really harsh towards Rand Paul, but I give Rand Paul a lot of credit for that. You know, he managed to stay in a lane where Trump had, you know, he had Trump's ear. Trump respected him. They had a good relationship. He would push back when he needed to. Yeah. But I really, as somebody who works in politics and knows how hard that would have been, like, I give him so much credit, and I really think we owe a lot to Rand Paul. I don't know that I believe Trump would have not entered another war had it not been for him. But you know, I think there was really strong work being done. I thought it was also refreshing to see a lot of the talking points on criminal justice reform that came out under that administration. So there were some highlights. There were some good things. Certainly the tax cuts didn't go far enough. Certainly they didn't cut spending like they needed to. You know, and a lot of criticisms deserved for that as well.
There is absolutely, because we had so many $1 trillion bills that he was spending more than Obama did in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. He was outspending the revenue that he was creating, and I think we missed a lot of opportunities. As somebody who used to be in the Tea Party myself, it's just more of the same when it came to Republicans, in my opinion.
That's exactly right. I kind of had my awakening around like 2013, 2014 of like, hang on a second, Republicans don't actually support limited government or vote for lower taxes. Wait, what's happening? You know, just all of a sudden like recognizing what was really going on behind the scenes. And it was a huge awakening for me. Everybody thinks that I became more libertarian because of Ron Paul, because so many people in my age group did, but I was not a Ron Paul fan. I actually was one of those people that was like, don't you dare split the vote. We have to get Mitt Romney and defeat Obama. That was who I was. And so, sorry, Ron Paul. But yeah, I think that was kind of my awakening of like, wait a second, you know, we're saying all this rhetoric. We're not actually living up to it. And it really forced me to go and figure out where I belonged and what I actually believed.
Yeah, I was very much in the same boat. I was a Ron Paul supporter when he was running. The only thing I couldn't get behind was his foreign policy. And then I graduated college in 2009, so I'm dating myself a little bit. But I graduated in 2009 and I joined the Army as a logistics officer. And we start to see foreign policy from a global perspective and actually understand how things work. It's kind of like the economy. You start looking at the individual pieces and how everything has kind of worked together and how they're trying to do the same thing as they do with the economy, and manipulate this piece over here and this piece over here to make everything kind of function right. And then you realize how just fucked up that really is.
Yep. I think I was going to mention this to you, but I love how many former members of the military are in the Liberty Movement. It's always so interesting to me, and I really wish we could elevate those voices more, because I think I would say the average person I speak with who's been in the military at some point has some very strong libertarian ideas.
No, you're absolutely right. Most people, there's something to be said about a group of people that can go in and not have and basically take their biases from government away and get along. When you really look at society and how society has started to, everything's now become about racist and homophobia and all this culture war, where that hasn't really affected the military. The military goes out and does its job, and they don't have those same issues as culture does. So there's something to be said about that, and it really does, and it really opens your eyes when you're in it, to see just really how the government operates, and how government budgets operate. Because I was a logistics officer, so we had the budgeting officers right next to us and stuff like that. So we're working on how much money is being spent and stuff like that, and you're just like, oh my God, you're just wasting money left and right. This is just not fiscally responsible at all. So you really do, you really get that good sense. Now that you're here in Georgia, Shane Hazel is the person to talk to. He's running for governor of the state of Georgia next year, and he is a former Marine, and he...
I know Shane. I've been on his show, I think,
a
while back. Yeah. Yeah, we've been... It's so funny. I know all these people from Twitter. I'm like, yeah, I know Shane. I've never met Shane. But Shane and I have been Twitter friends for a while, and I did a show a while back. And yeah, I like Shane a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Because like you said, me and you have been friends for a while, and this is the first time we've ever met in person because you just got here. So.
It's so funny because I really do feel like I talk to some people on Twitter more than I do like people I actually know in real life.
Yeah.
So you start to feel very close with people.
Well, and I've been meeting more and more Twitter friends these last few weeks and everything like that, and then I've made some of my best friends are people that I've met on Twitter because they kind of get you. The people in the Liberty Movement are very close. I met Shane last year at a Joe Jorgensen campaign event here in Atlanta, and I met Ryan Graham, and we were talking about this a couple weeks ago. Is I met him at that event, and we didn't even realize who each other were until we were talking the other day. I said, "Oh yeah, I was hanging out with Shane at the Jorgensen campaign event." And he was like, well, I was hanging out with Shane. I'm like, oh, then.
Oh, we already met.
We probably shook hands, and I was like, yeah.
Well, you were telling me that the area is pretty libertarian, so I'm really excited about that because I have not been in very libertarian places most of my life. I was in Nashville for a long time, which is very, very blue, and then obviously had a quick stint in New York City, which is very blue, and then for the past year I've been in South Carolina, which is polar opposite, super red, so.
Yeah, and I mean, I grew up in Michigan, so it's a little bit different because Michigan has always been a blue state, even though they swapped blue and red governors. But they've also been more liberty-minded as well when it came to like the Second Amendment and stuff like that because everybody's hunters up there. So they don't want to give that stuff up. But Georgia is one of these places, and especially the city of Atlanta, everybody carries a gun, and nobody really cares who you are.
Perfect. It's perfect. It's my kind of people.
Yeah.
Leave people alone and let them have their guns.
Exactly.
It's perfect. It's perfect city.
But I think we covered everything.
Cover all our bases.
I think we got everything. Thank you again for coming on and explaining everything. We will have to get together a whole lot more and talk more of this stuff because there's just so much happening right now in the liberty community and the economic community and just in politics in general. So again, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
And make sure that you go and click the link below to subscribe to this channel. More amazing guests like Hannah coming on here pretty soon. And again, go to the GoFundMe and help support this business that we're in right now, which is Manuel's Tavern. Thank you again.